This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everyone and welcome to Writers on Film. My name's John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Stuart Klawans, who is a award-winning journalist. He has been the film reviewer for The Nation since 1988 and has won a bunch of awards for his writing. And we're going to be talking about his new book, Crooked But Never Common, which is a study of the films of Preston Sturges, one of the most exciting, interesting filmmakers of the 40s. Just a really discovery. If you've never seen Preston Sturges films, then you're in for a real treat. Because you're going to get some recommendations via this podcast. If you have seen Preston Sturges films, then you are in for a treat as well, because you're going to get some new perspective and I'm sure new information about Preston Sturges. He's a brilliant director who I think, along with Lubitz, has sort of come into his own in critical circles as one of those sort of names to be conjured with. You might know him from. You'll certainly know the film Brother, Where Art Thou, which comes from a joke in Sullivan's Travels, one of Preston Sturges' films. But anyway, enough of me talking about it. Me, the inexpert of Preston Sturges, a fan, a definite enthusiast, but not an expert the way Stuart is. So let's leave the rest to Stuart. We're almost at our 100th episode. I've got a great guest for the 100th episode, so I'm looking forward to that. I hope you are too, but it's just a number. And anyway, I'm not even sure if it's the 100th or the 101st, because I have repeated one episode. So we've got 200th episodes, if you like, as we go forward. So that'll be very exciting. Anyway, enough of me blathering on. You can like the episode. Hopefully you'll like the episode as a thing, but then you can click on like, or you can share, or you can spread it over social media. That would be much appreciated. You can follow me on Twitter if you wish to do so, at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY, and keep an ear out for my new podcast, which is coming soon, Cinema Italia, which is going to be a journey through Italian cinema from soup to nuts. Okay, but enough. Shut up, John. Let's get the episode going, and I hope you enjoy the conversation.
My introduction came because of an old Chicago connection. Like Preston Sturges, I was born in Chicago. Unlike Preston Sturges, I grew up mostly in Chicago. He grew up back and forth between Chicago and the continent, where his mother was traipsing around with Isadora Duncan. So one of my...
Already we're there. Already we're there. We're in the world of amazing names and interesting combinations.
So it's not such an interesting combination in my case. I was a film society rat. I spent every hour I could when I was in college in the film society just soaking up celluloid. But I hadn't watched Preston Sturges. When I returned from college, I ran into an old friend who started telling me about Sturges, and the friend was astonished that I didn't know his work, and explained something about that, and explained that his first film, The Great McGinty, was set in the imaginary city of Chicago in the fictional state of Illinois. and urged me to watch his films, and pressed into my hand his own well-worn copy of Andrew Sarris's The American Cinema, so I could get started. So that was the beginning for me. My first Preston Sturges film was not The Great McGinty, as it happened. I began at a revival house in Chicago with a double bill of The Lady Eve and the Palm Beach Story.
Oh, wow. There's a double bill. What an amazing combination.
Yeah, that's still my idea of cinema heaven. So that was my introduction to Sturges. And I followed the tracks. Even with the first screenings, I could see that there was something wildly satisfying and amusing and energizing and smart in these films, and also something puzzling. There were very obvious loose threads dangling, and I couldn't believe that they were meant just to dangle. It seemed to me that whoever had made these knew that these were loose threads being left, and I couldn't quite pull them myself at that time, but I was sure that they ought to be pulled. So there, in maybe too many words, is how I got into Preston Sturges.
And in your introduction to the book, you make a very witty sort of parallel with Orson Welles. I mean, you describe a life that sounds like Orson Welles, and you say, but this was Orson Welles, and you thought you were reading a book about Preston Sturges. So, but the parallel sort of runs all the way through. And I think the argument that you make, I mean, I think there's a sort of almost an unspoken argument in the book that, you know, Wells gets a heck of a lot of attention, and rightfully so. You know, it's brilliant. You know,
rightfully so.
But Preston Sturges kind of deserves maybe a bigger fraction of that attention than he's getting.
You're absolutely right, and thank you for that. There is definitely an argument running through the book, unspoken, just because I don't want to press myself too much on the reader. There is a hierarchy of genres that we've inherited. It's a hierarchy that goes back centuries, if not millennia. At the top, you have epic and tragedy. In the middle, you've got history and romance. Romance in the sense of adventures that happen in fantastic, magical landscapes. At the very bottom is comedy. And to an astonishing extent, we hold on to this hierarchy of genres, but I don't see why. And I'm perfectly there. There are very good critics who have argued that these genres are interdependent and that they form a constellation of their own. So why be hierarchical about them? I see no reason to be hierarchical about comedy. I happen to love comedy, which means that Preston Sturges to me is one of the great filmmakers. There is a more explicit argument that I'm sure you've also seen, John, which is that people characterize Preston Sturges as a great writer of dialogue, which of course he was, and a great engineer of plots, which of course he was. And then they neglect what he did as a director. And they neglect perhaps one of the reasons he was so determined to become a director. In Hollywood in those days, you didn't become a director out of any illusions of exercising authorship, any illusions that you were expressing yourself. Express yourself was not an imperative in the Hollywood studios in any way. In fact, you didn't even say you were doing it. You couldn't. But if you became a director, then the movie turned out the way you would like it to. And if you watch Preston Sturges's direction, you see that he was a complete filmmaker and that the way he directed really made a difference. The way he directed the actors, the way he set up the scenes, the way the scenes played out. This was all very artfully done, very consciously done. He never developed the sort of visual style that you want to hang on the wall of a museum.
Right.
So he's not a Mizoguchi, he's not a Wells, he's not a Renoir, he's not a Tarkovsky, but it's his own visual style. The way he was directing alarmed the bosses at Paramount. They thought that he was taking great risks with their budget and schedule. But he was a great tinkerer, and he figured out ways to make things more efficient by the way he was directing, and actually saved them time and money to their shock. Not that they ever forgave him for saving him the time and money. They never forgave him anything. But nevertheless, it was his own visual style, his own methods. And I would argue that it was the only visual style anybody ever invented in which William Demarest could become a star.
In itself an achievement. If that was the only thing he ever did, that would absolutely. You mentioned a quote that is this is a quote that is never quoted except to be contradicted, which is F. Scott Fitzgerald talking about there are no second acts in American life. Nobody ever says, and he was right. They're always like,
no one ever.
It's like when someone intelligent says something stupid, that's the thing that's going to be quoted for the rest of posterity. But you make the point that he'd kind of already had his first act, in that he'd had a career in the theatre before he. And I'm sure some of our listeners might not know too much about his background or his, he's from Chicago. His mother is friends with Isadora Duncan. We've already established that. Could you just give us a little bit more of his background before he gets to Hollywood?
Sure, and I'll try to make this brief. While just saying, yes, Fitzgerald didn't say anything stupid there, but Americans are incurably optimistic. We shouldn't be. People from other parts of the world roll their eyes at us about how unrealistic we are, how naive. But of course, every time anybody brings up the Fitzgerald quote, we always immediately say, oh, no, but that's not true. So Sturges was not purely American, though. He did grow up on the continent. Late in life, when he was living in France and was hanging out, this is in the 1950s, with his good friend René Clair. At one point, René Clair turned to him and said, "Preston, it's very odd. You speak the French of a 16-year-old schoolboy." And Sturges said, "That's because the last time I lived in France, I was a 16-year-old schoolboy."
Brilliant.
But that was half of his upbringing. The other half was in Chicago. His father, his adoptive father, Sullivan Sturges, whom he loved wholeheartedly, whom he admired heart and soul. Sullivan Sturges was part of a banking and stockbroking family in Chicago that is part of the upper crust in what was the world's biggest boom town. And he adopted Sturges when he married Mary Dempsey, or as she later called herself, Marie Desty. And Solomon Sturges was a businessman and a member of the Chicago Athletic Club and a slap the other fellow on the back type of guy. And Sturges was very attracted to that. And throughout his films, you see many businessmen who are very admirable figures in his films. They're jolly people, they're realistic people, they're good people, they do the right thing, they're sensible. This is actually a little unusual for American film in the period, when it was more common to take the piss out of businessmen in movies.
Yeah.
So that was the upbringing between those two. Sturges never really settled into doing anything until he was in his late 20s. He managed to marry an heiress. He was living on an estate in Connecticut that they had bought with her money, hanging out, being a gentleman. And one day she came to him and said, "Well, Preston, I've really had it, and I'm leaving. I'm going to Paris. Goodbye. I'm getting a divorce." He was shattered, absolutely shattered, even though he was 29 years old and a man of the world. So he ran back to Chicago to his adoptive father, which the only home he had, tried to recover himself, eventually decided that he would go to New York and he would become a playwright. Well, actually, he didn't decide playwriting immediately. He also tried being a songwriter, but he was going to do something like that, be a songwriter, be a playwright.
Popular entertainment.
Yes.
Yeah.
But not popular like the movies. Not cheap, vulgar, tawdry, new entertainment. He was going to be a man of the theater. And it took him about 1 year until he wrote a smash Broadway comedy called Strictly Dishonorable. And so in his early 30s, Sturges became what he thought he ought to be, which was wealthy in his own right and famous and admired and hobnobbing with literary people in New York, literary and theater people in New York. So he had done it. First act completed. And to complete it, he married the daughter of Marjorie Merriweather Post and the adoptive daughter of E.F. Hutton, Eleanor Hutton. So he married a very beautiful young woman who was even more wealthy than the first wife.
It sounds like one of his comedies. He's constantly marrying heiresses, you know. It's like...
And not only that, but he wound up as a house guest. Before they married, he was a house guest in Palm Beach at the estate of Marjorie Merriweather Post. Mar-a-Lago, now known as a national disgrace. But at that point, Mar-a-Lago was a private residence of Marjorie Merriweather Post and E.F. Hutton. And Sturges was not exactly welcome there. But the E.F. Hutton in particular seems to have looked at him askance. But there it was. He was rich. He was famous. He had made his own money. And then he blew it all up. He had a series... He had a series of flops on Broadway, one after the other, and eventually Eleanor Hutton became disenchanted with him. And by the time he was about 33, he was broke again and desperate to get screenwriting work. And that's how he wound up in Hollywood as a contract writer. So that was the first act. Yeah.
Wow. And it's so interesting as well that he gets to Hollywood, unlike so Orson Welles gets to Hollywood and he's riding a wave of sort of fame and notoriety and success.
Yes.
But Preston turns up to Hollywood and he's kind of like washed out of one career basically and has to start again.
Yes, but there is a little bit of a twist there.
Okay.
Because when Sturges came to Hollywood, he had already made himself well known as a screenwriter for a project called The Power and the Glory, which was made by Fox, starring Spencer Tracy. This was a very unusual project for the time. The film was made from a script that Sturges had written on speculation. Already you're in unknown territory for Hollywood. They didn't just pick up entire scripts from somebody. And when they did, they didn't just make the script. That was unknown. But they bought the script from Sturges. They made a big deal of having bought a complete script from famous Broadway writer Preston Sturges. They backed this project to the extent that when they premiered the film at the Gaiety Theater in New York, in the lobby they had a glass case where they displayed the script as an artifact.
Wow. Wow. I can't imagine anyone having that degree of respect for the written word anymore. Like Netflix or something, you know, displaying here's this treatment for the new TV show that we're going to do.
Exactly. As it turned out, The Power and the Glory was not a box office success. That's what threw him back on his heels. He had to accept a job at Universal as a contract writer. But with those credits behind him, he wasn't just a contract writer. And the parallel with Welles actually holds because this was a period in which the Hollywood studios were importing, number one, they were importing talent from Broadway, which was a normal thing to do in the early days of the talkies. They needed material. Where were they going to get it? So they were importing writers from the East Coast, especially dialogue writers from Broadway. But by the end of the 1930s, it was clear economically that where Hollywood was making its biggest profits was in prestige films in first-run theaters. So there was an economic impetus to buy prestige. So when RKO brings in Orson Welles, they're buying prestige. They've got world-famous man of the theater and radio whom they're bringing in. And they made headlines with it, and this was a big deal to do it. And there's something of the same thing going on with Sturges. Paramount made money on his films, and they were happy to make the money, but they weren't making money hand over fist with him the way they were, for example, with the Bing Crosby, Bob Hope road movies. What Preston Sturges was giving them was profit, but prestige. He was big prestige for Paramount Pictures. That mattered to them. So there was that window from the late 30s into the early years of the U.S. involvement in World War II, when the studios really were buying this. So that's where the parallel with Welles actually does hold up.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's fascinating that even occurs to some degree, through the whole history of Hollywood, that studios are willing to take a bath on certain directors or certain things because they need an Oscar, and they want a critical write-up, and they're kind of, yeah, it's something I think we forget when we're looking at something like Box Office Mojo or something like that, and judging things only by those criteria, that it doesn't work quite like that,
Exactly. Though by the about 42, 43, Hollywood is making so much money during wartime that it's realizing we don't necessarily have to keep these prestigious people on contract. If they want to stick around, fine. If they don't, we don't really need them.
Yeah.
And that's when Orson Welles is kicked out of RKO. That's the point where the new administration at RKO distributed in-house stationery with the logo "Entertainment, not Genius."
they might as well have just said "Not Orson Welles."
Yes, exactly. And screw Orson Welles. Yeah. And this is also the period when Preston Sturges is pretty much pushed out of Paramount by its new head of production. It's nice to have you around. If you want to play ball with us and be good little kids, fine, you can, but we don't really need you. Go away.
Yeah. And so he starts directing. I mean, he does this screenwriting work, and which you cover as well. It's in the book. But the first, I think this might be the first film I saw was Sullivan's Travels, which I'd already I was aware of because of the Coen brothers and "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" But the film I saw after that was The Great McGinty, which is the sort of one of the very early chapters of your book, and this is what you said earlier about there are threads that a film has that you feel needed pulling, and this is a brilliant example of this. That it's so rich with insight and about the American political system, and kind of just generally about politics. What was the sort of lead up to this production, and what's your own take on the film?
Well, that was the first film that he wrote and directed.
Right.
When he hit Hollywood, he would every once in a while take out of his trunk the screenplay he had written for something called, I think it was called Autobiography of a Bum. And he would try to sell it to the studios with himself as director. Never worked. But by 1939, he invited the head of production at Paramount, William LeBaron, to his house for dinner, and he made the pitch again. And this time, LeBaron said, "Okay, I'm going to let you do it." And at the time, the way Sturges made the pitch was, if you let me direct this screenplay, I'll sell it to you for $1. So LeBaron said, "I'm going to take a chance on you." Now, LeBaron's lawyer said that $10 was not enough for a legal contract. I mean, $1 was not enough. They decided you better make it 10. So he sold the screenplay for $10. He directed it. And he won an Academy Award. I believe that was the first Academy Award for original screenplay.
Wow.
And this was something really unknown in Hollywood in the sound era, the studio system in the sound era, that somebody writes a complete screenplay and then directs it. This was completely unknown. So that's where the film falls historically.
Mm.
Now, where it falls in terms of his work, number one, it's an amazingly well-crafted screenplay. People, of course, revel in the dialogue. People revel in its raffishness, its sense that the filmmaker is on the side of the crooks. I mean, ever since John Gay, the reversal of accepted value has been a standard part of English language theater, right?
Right.
We'll go back to 1728, The Beggar's Opera. That's when it starts. I mean, there have been some before that, but that's when it becomes a big thing. The biggest hit of the English theater of the 18th century, produced nonstop ever since.
Brecht is rewriting it right in this period.
Right. The inspiration for the Threepenny Opera, the whole thing, yes. But what's different from John Gay to Preston Sturges is with John Gay, there's an ironic distance. And with Preston Sturges, he's kind of on the side of the crooks. He enjoys the crooks. He thinks that they're clever. He thinks that they're doing what they have to do to get by. He's actually for them. And even the love interest in the Great McGinty, who is an idealistic young woman, or so it seems, she's not so straight herself. There's something crooked there too. So that you can see all of that, you can revel in that without taking the film apart and seeing how every last nail is in place, how all the proportions of the screenplay are engineered to the nth degree. Everything fits. It's the most amazing work of carpentry. And it's just amazing. And when you start seeing that, then you start noticing something else, and it's a puzzle. This is one of the puzzles that Sturges throws out. Why does the main character not have a name until a third of the film has gone by? He just doesn't have a name. People call him Lug, they call him Slug, they call him Wise Guy. Well, he's a bum. He's somebody who's off a soup line. He's a nobody, literally a nobody. He has no name. There is an early moment in the film during a frame sequence where you hear somebody call him in a choked voice, Dan, but it happens, almost instantaneously. You almost can't hear it. It kind of doesn't count. This guy goes through the film without a name, except when he's going to polling places and voting under false circumstances, where he's pretending to be other people. Then he has lots of names. Then he's Dr. Emanuel Schiffnagel, and he's Emanuel Goldberg, and they give him lots of names. He has no name for a third of the film. And what's also interesting is that the gangster overlord of Chicago, played by Akim Tamirov, also doesn't have a proper name. He's just the boss. So why is there this surplus anonymity in the film? It's more anonymity than anybody needs. There's just so much of it. And then you start looking at what this guy does. When he is still just a runner for the overlord of Chicago, he goes out to collect the protection money. This is set during the Prohibition era. And he goes to a succession of businesses to collect. They're businesses that dare not speak their own names. He goes to a fortune-telling parlor, which is obviously a brothel.
Right.
He goes to a furniture showroom, which is obviously a speakeasy. He goes to an insurance brokerage, which is clearly a bookie joint. Nothing will say what its own name is in this movie. So you just start watching all of this happening. Then I asked myself, so why is he called McGinty? Sturges didn't come out to the name of McGinty until the film was actually going into production. It took him that long. He wrote it in, I think, 33. It's 39. When the film is going into production, that's when he comes up with the name for the character. I think in one of the interim drafts, he'd been called O'Hara, which is as much as not having a name. Let's face it.
Yeah, it's John Smith, isn't it? It's a sort of Irish John Smith.
Yeah. So he calls him McGinty, and I wondered why McGinty. The first title he gave it when he did that was Down Went McGinty. And I thought, that's a funny name for anything, Down Went McGinty. And I thought, sounds like a song title. Sounds like the refrain of a song. So I rooted around a little bit, and yes, it's an 1880s music hall number about a comic Irishman. That's where the name came from.
Right.
It's an old song. And Sturges actually had the composer at Paramount, Fritz Hollander, use the music from that song as the theme music for the film. So it all connects. That's all there. It's all there. But the people at Paramount said, yeah, Down Went McGinty. That's not such a great title, though. Let's call it The Great McGinty. So the name McGinty stuck, the music stuck, but the reasons for it are sort of shrouded in mystery. They're back there but the fact that it's called that, the fact that the character is called that to me is also part of this surplus anonymity, this theme running through it of just being absolutely nobody, which means in the case of the main character that there are endless possibilities. He's nobody, so he can be anybody.
Yeah, and it's sort of like an effervescent sort of freedom that is discharged. But that thing about the music hall song, which you bring up in the book as well, is one of the arguments that I was really struck by was how Preston Sturges is really coming out of a late 19th century sort of Victoriana tradition of comedy and of vaudeville and that sort of material. I think that's and similarly to Wells as well. You know, Wells going to Dublin and going to the theatre, and you know, all the old people he was meeting and acting with were people who were on the stage for the large part of their careers in the Victorian period. So that's really interesting, I think, going into Sturges' career.
You're absolutely right. Wells has this nostalgia for the Gaslight era, which is very much tied to his father. He saw that as part of his father's life, and that's one of the backgrounds to the Magnificent Ambersons. It was very much the same with Sturges. Sturges was about 10 years older than Wells, but his father's adoptive father, Sullivan Sturges, was definitely a man of the Gaslight era. And I think that that's part of what plays into The Great McGinty. As I said, the film is set in the 1920s, but there's sort of a Gaslight era atmosphere that hovers over it. Even so, it seems older than it actually is.
I would love. This is a problem with doing a podcast, which is this could be a 3-hour podcast, because I'd love to go through each of these films individually, and they're so rich and there's so much about them. But I guess the one question would be, what is your favorite of these films? What would be your film that you would show someone who hasn't watched a Preston Sturges film before?
I have professed in the past, and I'll profess it happily to you now, my favorite of them all is The Lady Eve.
Right.
And yes.
With the great Barbara Stanwyck and Henry Fonda.
And the great Henry Fonda, yes. The only film Sturges made where he had two such stars as his leads. And he is, as we've touched on this, he's very well known for mostly casting a lot of bit players he collected around the Paramount lot, such as William Demarest. And he would work with stars when he could. For the Palm Beach Story, he worked with Claudette Colbert, who was the biggest female star at Paramount. But The Lady Eve is the one film where he had two really big stars. who could act on the level of Henry Fonda and Barbara Stanwyck. There were subtleties, nuances of the acting that he just never got with anybody else. Just not available to him. Not that it stopped him with his other films. But it's my favorite because it's the film in which the characters at the last moment almost magically break out of a predicament that runs throughout many of his films. One of the themes that you can trace when you look across the films is a horror, a really deep horror of being stuck in the same thing over and over again. It's this Nietzschean sense of the eternal return, that with nature you're supposed to embrace it, and Sturges is horrified at the idea. You can see this in many ways in his films. One of the ways you see it is his repeated use of flashback structures in the films. He makes, and it's intentional in this part, it's not just a device. He makes films where at the end, the characters are right back where they started. They just, structurally, they just circle right back. You also see it in the situations of people like John L. Sullivan, the film director in Sullivan's Travels, who keeps trying to go out on the road so he can learn about how people live when times are tough. And every time he goes out on the road to do that, somehow he winds up being dumped back in Beverly Hills. and there's a moment when he's got a bad cold and he's feverish and he cries out, there seems to be some sort of universal law. As you are, so shall you remain. That's something that runs throughout these films. And Sturges is horrified by it. One of the reasons that you root for Sullivan in Sullivan's Travels, even though he's kind of a dunderhead and a stiff and has no sense of humor. He's a great director of comedies, but he has no sense of humor. One of the reasons that you root for this guy is because he's really trying to get out of his situation. He really wants to penetrate into a different part of life, and he can't. But the struggle to do so is honorable, it's admirable. So there's that sense in the films. The one film in which the characters are literally just back right where they started, and then at the end, suddenly, magically, they break out of it. That's The Lady Eve. And as the biblical parallels in the film might suggest, there is actually a sense of redemption there. So that's why, that's a large reason why it's one of my favorites. It's also the film in which, to the highest degree, you've Sturges's very characteristic combination of true sophistication and shameless slapstick.
Yes, which can't be. I mean, those two things are not antithetical. I think slapstick can be sophisticated.
Yes. You can see how sophisticated slapstick can be in Unfaithfully Yours, which stars Rex Harrison. The last 15 minutes of Unfaithfully Yours are an extended, almost without dialogue, slapstick sequence in which Rex Harrison is subjected to every indignity that Preston Sturges can imagine for him. And you can see that Rex Harrison just loves doing the slapstick. He's throwing himself into it with glee. Now, Henry Fonda in The Lady Eve did not like doing the slapstick. Right. Henry Fonda just thought that slapstick was beneath him. He was a great actor, though. He made it work for him. His frustration and animosity toward the slapstick, he lets read in the character. So every time the character is humiliated by tumbling over something, you can see the strained smile on Henry Fonda's face as he tries to recover from this. Of course, there's a reason why his character keeps falling. This is a biblical story. This is about the fall of man, except it's the fall and the fall and the fall and the fall of man.
Yeah, it was tragic if it happens once, but if it happens over and over again, it quickly becomes comic.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, there's this idea as well. I was just thinking what you said earlier about the Great McGinty, where he has this irrepressible sympathy and admiration for people because of their energy rather than because of where they are on the moral, some sort of societal or moral judgment. They're criminals, but it doesn't matter because they're energetic and they're trying stuff. He seems to have this really democratic love of people generally, in the sense that he doesn't stop and think, okay, this character's a woman, so she can't have that. He gives each character, regardless of their gender or to some extent as well their race, an interest and an originality, or even in terms of like one of the points you make, the number of characters which are quite small characters who he gives wonderful language to. Then, there's no walk-on part in a Sturges film that can't have a grace note, which will make you remember it more than you remember most protagonists in lesser productions.
Yes. I think one of the telltale signs in Sturges is that he very seldom used malapropism as a comic device.
Right.
Malapropism is really one of the stocks in trade of comic writers. Sturges had the full rhetorical arsenal at his command. He used everything, but very seldom malapropism, because malapropism is a joke on the character. You're laughing at the character's ignorance. So he threw out a few malapropisms. Even there, he tends to make the malapropism absolutely to the point. So the character uses the language incorrectly, but still manages to say something apt.
Right.
So an example of that is in The Sin of Harold Diddlebach, where this barfly hears somebody talk about doing something for posterity, and the barfly mumbles, "Posterity is just around the corner." Which is the wrong cliche. On the other hand, he's correct.
Right.
You can't deny it. Yeah. So yes, Sturges is reluctant to use malapropism is part and parcel of what you just mentioned, that he gives everybody good dialogue. And part of that is just his pride in his own artistry. I was going to say craft, but it's artistry. His pride in that, his pride in his talent, that he can give everybody good lines. But part of that is a certain democratic spirit in the films. Now, when he's at his best, the democratic spirit reigns. And again, as with the marriage of sophistication and slapstick, the marriage of a democratic spirit and utter cynicism that's an odd yoke. Yeah. Right? But you find that in the films. He does love all these characters, and he wants all of them to be able to say clever things. And on a certain level, he's for all of them. They're all okay. One of the lines I quote in what is not really a conclusion to the book, in Rules of the Game, Renoir has the character that he himself plays. He has the character say, in summing up, the terrible thing is everybody has his own reasons. But in Sturges, everybody has his own reasons, and that's why we're all so funny.
Right.
That's what generates the comedies. We all have our reasons. Yes. We're all right.
I mean, I've heard tragedy explained in that way. Tragedy is when everybody's right, but you could equally. I think any definition of tragedy has to also be a definition of comedy. It just doesn't. Otherwise, it doesn't. It doesn't scan.
Strangely enough, yes.
Yeah.
Strangely enough.
One of the things that I think struck me when I watched his films for the first time and got deeper into them. You mentioned this, I think, in terms of The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, but I think the same could be said as well for Hail the Conquering Hero and even Sullivan's Travels, is just how your mouth sort of hangs open when you watch these films. How the hell did they make these films? Because the subject matter is just so irreverent and you know, I mean, the Miracle of Morgan's Creek is all about an unwed mother, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. The more, if I give you the synopsis, you would say, okay, that came out in the 1990s. It couldn't have come out in the 1940s. And similarly, Hail of the Conquering Hero is about, a Second World War heroic tale, which is entirely fabricated. And yet we are all party to that fabrication and approve of it. You know, we love it.
Yes. Well, with The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, it was amazing that the film got made. It was possible in that era to make a film about a woman who gets pregnant out of wedlock, but the production code said that she had to suffer as a result.
Right.
She could not come out all right if she had gotten pregnant out of wedlock. She could not get pregnant out of wedlock and then be party to 4 other crimes on top of that, which is what happens in The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, where they keep just piling felony on top of felony in an attempt to get out of the predicament. You could not make this film. He managed somehow to get it done. This was one of his 2 frontal assaults on the Production Code Authority.
Right.
And if Sturges were credited for nothing else in film history, it would be for having mounted these full-out attacks on the prudery of the production code. He did it in The Palm Beach Story, which on its surface is the frothiest possible comedy about giddy rich people. It's a direct attack on the ideology of monogamy. It's what the film comes down to. It is.
It's how much you're making that film today.
Yes, it's a film that even today, every Jill must have her preordained Jack, and Jack his predestined Jill. And once they realize that they are made for each other, they must get married as soon as possible and stay that way. The ideology of romantic love and monogamy, and The Palm Beach Story is a frontal assault on this ideology that is held so dearly by so many of us. The production code wasn't designed out of nowhere. The production code was designed to protect the delicate sensibilities of the public so they would not be offended by films. Sturges went right out and offended people. He got away with offending.
He just drove a tank through them.
He drove a tank through it, but in The Palm Beach Story, because it doesn't seem to be a tank at all, it seems to be a parade float, right? It's just gaudy fun, sure, but that's what the film comes down to. The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, young woman does what she's supposed to do, which is give a rousing, memorable farewell to the boys going off to war. And she has a great time doing it. And there are consequences which can't be hidden forever. But Sturges just doesn't pretend that there's anything wrong with her doing what everybody says you ought to do. which is give these boys a good time. And so
I'm just thinking of her stepfather his signature act is to try to kick someone and then fall flat on his ass when he does it.
Yes.
It's like, which seems to be, that's what he's saying our morality always is. It's a self-defeating gesture that never, ends up hurting us more than anything else.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So again, how did he get this film made? That was very difficult. That was the one film in which he did not start production with a completed screenplay. And he didn't start with a completed screenplay because he kept getting demands from the Production Code Authority and also from the military censors, because they also were weighing in on how the servicemen could be portrayed. That was less of a problem than the production code, but just before he was starting production, he got a 7-page single-spaced letter from the Production Code Authority telling him what he could not do. So Sturges, for the Miracle of Morgan's Creek, actually had to go into production, shooting what he could during the day. Then he would go home, sit at his typewriter at night, and write the next part of the script. He had never done that before. And he was definitely not one of the Hollywood directors who was comfortable with improvisation. He was not somebody like Leo McCarey who would make things up on set. So this was a real struggle for him, and it was a real struggle for the actors who had a tough time with him on that production.
Yeah, you make a point that one of the lead actors sort of threatened to punch his lights out because of his behavior at that point.
Eddie Bracken, who gives one of the greatest physical comedy performances in film history in The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. Eddie Bracken was a physical comedy genius.
Yeah.
On a level, you can't say on a level with Chaplin and Keaton. You're not supposed to say that, but you're getting up there with Eddie Bracken. He's just about on that level. And he always played the little schnook. And in The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, he plays the little hapless schnook. But Eddie Bracken was an amateur boxing champion. And when Sturges crossed a line with him on the set one day, Bracken just cocked his fist and looked him in the eye and grinned, as if to say it to me one more time and you're down. and Sturges backed off.
Wisely. Very wisely by the sound of it.
Yeah.
So when he's making these movies, is his they look like they should be enormous fun to make, but is he under a lot of pressure from the studios? How are they being received as well? Are they being big hits, or is there a bit more of an up and downness to the reception?
When William LeBaron was the head of production at Paramount, William LeBaron, who authorized Sturges to direct, and whose name you hear echoed in Sullivan's Travels. One of the studio heads in Sullivan's Travels is named Mr. LeBrand.
Right.
Yeah. Might as well be Mr. Logo, but but also besides being Mr. LeBrand, he's it's a little bit of a nod to William LeBaron. He gave Sturges great support when Sturges was filming the Great McGinty, his first time out as director. He had a health crisis in the middle of production. If I remember correctly, it was pneumonia. And he wound up in the hospital. And Sturges really thought that he was going to be taken off the film because they were in production, they weren't shooting. This is costing money.
Right.
And William LeBaron came to the hospital. He had watched the rushes, and he came to the hospital and he told Sturges, "Get well, it's waiting for you." So
nice.
he supported Sturges with the Great McGinty, and he got a success d'estime, and he made money. The same thing happened with Christmas in July. The same thing happened in The Lady Eve. They weren't huge money makers for Paramount, but they made money.
Right.
Then Buddy DeSilva became the head of production, and things got rough for Sturges. And they got rough just at the time that he made Sullivan's Travels, his fourth film as a writer-director. It was the first time he directed a film based on a script he had written, knowing he would direct.
Right.
The first three were pre-existing scripts to some extent. With Sullivan's Travels, he's written something knowing he's going to direct, and he takes the tremendous risk of making a movie that has no fixed genre. Even today, you're not supposed to do that. When you turn on Netflix, you're looking at what's available, everything has 3 words at the bottom to tell you what kind of a movie it is. Dark, sexy, funny, whatever. They throw it in. Yeah. Disturbing, controversial. Yeah, whatever. There was no genre to Sullivan's Travels, or whether it's several genres all mixed into one, and you never know in any one moment. It's like the Chicago weather. You don't like what you're watching, wait 5 minutes. You'll get a different genre.
4 seasons in one day.
It just keeps changing, right? So that was a tremendous risk. And it can't be said that Buddy DeSilva supported him. In fact, Buddy DeSilva did what he could to undermine the film by ordering Sturges. Number one, this is a film in which Sullivan and his companion, one of the weaker, maybe the weakest female roles that Sturges wrote, for Veronica Lake as the girl. There's some anonymity for you. I don't think she's given a name anywhere in the film. She's just the girl.
Right.
They go out and they're walking through Depression era America, and Buddy DeSilva told him, tone down the misery. He wanted to cut remarkable 7-minute silent sequence of these people just seeing the desperate circumstances people are living in. That's a sequence that makes the film, but DeSilva wanted it gone. And the climax of the film is an astonishing sequence set in a black church in the rural South. You almost cannot assimilate this scene into classic Hollywood because it is so respectful of black people, so dignified in the presentation of black people. When Sullivan's Travels came out, the executive director of the NAACP sent a letter of thanks to Sturges for this film. And it includes a sermon by a black preacher played by an actor named Jess Lee Brooks, an actor who generally refused to work in Hollywood films. He worked in black cinema. He worked in the parallel black cinema because he thought all the roles being offered black actors by Hollywood were insulting. But he played in Sullivan's Travels. It's fascinating. The sermon he delivers in the film is word for word the sermon that Sturges wrote. Sturges actually wrote a sermon that fits easily in the mouth of this actor playing a black preacher. And the other directive that Buddy DeSilva gave Sturges was cut the black preacher. This is what Sturges found himself up against suddenly.
Once more.
He resisted. He won because Sullivan's Travels was well received. But you don't want to win against your boss. That's a dangerous thing to do. Buddy DeSilva really gave Sturges no end of trouble after that. You ask about the box office reception. His biggest hit at the box office by far was The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. The release was delayed by about a year by Buddy DeSilva. During that time, DeSilva tried to cut the film himself. When they previewed it, it was a disaster. They had to ask Sturges to come back and recut the film. So Sturges's cut of the film was released a year later than it might have been, and was his biggest hit. They had people lining up around the block for this film, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower was one of its biggest fans.
I mean, we look at that this sort of period as well as this period of sort of coming out of the war and being somehow being a really conformist sort of, that's the cliche. And yeah, Sturges just strikes me as such an antidote to that. I mean, I know he's reacting to it in a sense, and so that's why you're getting this, spiciness. But unfortunately, I mean, the same with Orson Welles. You make this point. That's one of the sadder parallels. Is they kind of come sort of to a relatively abrupt end in terms of their Hollywood careers.
Yes.
What happens there?
What happens is that they follow a path that many American filmmakers took in the late 40s and the 50s, some for economic reasons, some because of the blacklist. a lot of American filmmakers went to Europe. The economic reason was that the studios had a lot of blocked funds in Europe, so they moved a lot of production overseas. They could use the blocked funds. They could spend the money there. They could not take the money out and use it in the United States. So they produced there. Production was also much cheaper there. This was also a period in which the studios were finding it useful and lucrative to spin out fixed assets. They no longer saw why they were maintaining these vast swaths of Los Angeles real estate. They could get them and have the money. They realized they didn't have to keep so many people on payroll all the time. They could cut the contracts. The higher paid talent, directors and actors, were setting up independent companies for themselves so they could be paid as a company, not as a contract person. It had tax benefits. So there were all these reasons why production was breaking up in the United States. People were going overseas. And the other part of it was the blacklist. With Welles, it was both. Welles was a man of the Popular Front. The political atmosphere in the United States was not so great for him, starting in the late 40s. And the opportunities in Europe were greater, so he relocated. Sturges hung around in the United States. He was a man of the right. Blacklist didn't matter to him. He was fine. He was a rock-ribbed conservative. But when he could no longer even get arrested by the Hollywood studios, he decided, I'm going to go overseas. I'm going to try to make some money in all these co-productions and independent productions overseas. Welles was somebody who was able to work in that milieu. It was hard for him, but he managed to make The Trial. He made Chimes at Midnight. He made F for Fake. He kept himself going. He had many, many theater productions and TV productions at the same time. Welles managed to float there. Sturges didn't. He sank. He just couldn't do it. And for various reasons. So you could say that Welles never really got his due, ultimately. Though when Welles was given a Lifetime Award by the American Film Institute, he said, "People say that I could have done better if I had just stayed within the studios and not struggled to make these films the way I did. But if I had done that, they wouldn't have been my films."
Yeah.
So Welles was at peace with himself for having done what he did. Sturges died still struggling to make a deal with somebody for something. So the end of his life, it's the last decade is not a happy story. But what came before was a miraculous second act in an American life.
Right. And unbelievable. I think you really make the point incredibly convincingly, and I think anybody who's listening to this should immediately watch The Lady Eve, Sullivan's Travels, Miracle at Morgan's Creek, The Great McGinty, Hail the Conquering Hero. Those are my 5 favorites. I haven't watched all of them, so I'll have to catch up on the Rex Harrison film. I've not watched, for instance, so I think I need to catch up on that.
It's an extraordinarily daring film. It's
right.
Amazing. That's another film where it's amazing that he managed to get away with it. Unfaithfully Yours is more or less a comic prologue to Vertigo, made about 10 years before Hitchcock dared to do it. So Unfaithful Yours is an amazing film, and every writer, of course, falls in love with Christmas in July because it's the film about writing.
Right.
It's about a man who's writing advertising slogans, which don't quite make sense, but they almost make sense. So they become terrible earworms that you just worry over.
The superiority is born in the bean. It's bred in the bean.
Right. Yeah. So, yes. But of course, The Lady Eve, which is the film that gives my book its title, which I will plug.
The photograph
Crooked but never common.
and the photograph on the cover is Barbara Stanwyck glued to a very nervous-looking Henry Fonda, and that's something else like we haven't really talked about, but worth a mention is the sort of sexual energy in that film is just
yes,
off the charts.
Yes. Yes, it absolutely is. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another reason I love it, yes.
Yeah, anything with Barbara Stanwyck being sexy is gonna win, or for that matter, Miriam Hopkins or loads of other brilliant brilliant stars of that era. I have one last question for you, Stuart, and I'd love to have a much longer time to talk to you, but hopefully you'll come back on the podcast and talk to us again. But my last question is for a recommended film book. We're always trying to broaden people's horizons with good quality film books. Have you got something you could recommend for us?
I'm going to give you two, John.
That's great.
Quickly. Number one, many of your listeners may know this book already, but I'm plugging it anyway because it's very influential on my book. It's Stanley Cavell's book, Pursuits of Happiness, The American Comedy of Remarriage. It's an utterly brilliant book in which Cavell invents a genre so that he can examine so he can examine the rules that make the genre work. And it's about The Lady Eve. It's about The Awful Truth, about His Girl Friday. All these films made in a certain era in Hollywood in which couples break up and then have to get together again on a different basis. So Stanley Cavell's Pursuits of Happiness, The American Comedy of Remarriage. But the new book that I would urge people to look for, it's just coming out soon. It's from Terra Nova Press, distributed by MIT Books. It's a new book by Jeffrey O'Brien, the poet, essayist, critic, scholar. It's a fabulous book, and I'm using the word fabulous advisedly. The title is Arabian Nights of 1934. It's a book in which Jeffrey O'Brien puts together it's partly delirious and partly absolutely realistic picture of American society in the era from about 1930 to 1934. That is the era of pre-code talkies in Hollywood.
Right.
So he takes situations, characters, lines of dialogue from, I think there are 2-3 dozen films that he's merged to make this portrait of America. And O'Brien understands very clearly that there's a sense in which the pre-code talkies didn't just represent American society at that moment in history. There's a sense in which they were America at that moment in history. That was a point in which social reality and the movies were utterly merged. Then the code was enforced, and it was as if a wall came down between what was on the screen of the movie theater and what was going on outside. So that's the theme of the book. It's a wonderful book, Arabian Nights of 1934 by Jeffrey O'Brien.
Brilliant. And of course, that wall that comes down, then Preston Sturges starts knocking bricks out of it one by one with each of his films.
Exactly.
I can't imagine just thinking back to the 1930s or thinking back to sort of walking out of the cinema having seen The Miracle of Morgan's Creek or Lady Eve or anything, and just emerging into the world in which this is contemporary to my life and thinking, what wonderful times we live in, where we have this, do you know what I mean? We have this wonderful writer and filmmaker and this, these people who talk so cleverly and wittily, and it's amazing. I'd love to go back in a time machine and be able to do that.
If we did, we might wind up being like James Agee and Manny Farber, great critics who complained that Sturges held back from really criticizing what was going on in society, that he would go only so far, and then he would wrap things up with a happy ending. So if you and I had been back there, John, we might have made those complaints too. At a distance, we can look at these films and see that the happy endings aren't so happy, that things are not so uncomplicated where he leaves them as they might seem to be. There's more to it than that. So there is that. But A.G. also said, going to your point of what it was like to leave the theater having seen The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, James A.G. wrote that it had been like conversing with a nun on a roller coaster.
What an amazing image. That's superb. And hopefully this podcast has been a little bit like conversing with two nuns on the roller coaster.
Which is this the nun? I'm not sure, but anyway.
Well, that's why I said two nuns, so we don't have to decide. We can both read.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful.
All right.
Stuart, thank you so
Wonderful
much.
to join. Thank you for letting me join you for matins. I appreciate it.
Exactly.
Thank you for having me, John. It's a pleasure.
So that was my conversation with Stuart. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we obviously did. We really got into it. I thought it was a lot of fun. Stuart's got a brilliant, he's just got a brilliantly encyclopedic knowledge of cinema, and it was a real honor and privilege to sit and talk to him for the podcast. So wonderful. And you have some more recommended books to read as well, as do I. So until next week, I'm not sure who we have next week. Anyway, until next week, please take care.